Well, Roberto, thanks very much for making time today. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. Um, I've been a fan, actually, of you for a number of years now on Twitter. Uh, Maybe going 3, maybe going on 4 years. This is the first time we've ever had a conversation beyond our texting prepping for this. But I did buy your book, a printed version, when it came out on the dollar milkshake theory. And and I think and the reason I wanted to talk with you is, I mean, I've been personally interested in economics, just as a side topic for many years. But I found your writings and explanations online to be very straightforward and coherent and understandable, and much more than other writings I've around economics in general.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the quotes I like to live by is, Einsteinian quote that, if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it. And the problem with a lot of modern economics is they overcomplicate things. They use nomenclature and jargon to, obfuscate the truth and the simple realities of economics that underlie our modern, market system are obfuscated because of that. They're kind of hidden, and so it makes the entire field much much more difficult just because of how many untruths and half truths that exist. And so my goal with a lot of my writing is to kind of burst through that and to show the reality of what's happening.
I think that's fantastic. And well, and financial literacy in this country is a real problem. Um, what you don't know can be very dangerous, and just even understanding how rates work, the impact it can have on you personally. I mean, it's taken me many years, and mistakes to finally put my own financial life into proper order, and I'm still not quite there yet, as many people aren't. But so listen, tell me. Well, you go by online, or you have until very recently, though still continuing. You're known as the Peruvian Bull. Um, I'm gonna make a wild guess that maybe it's because you're from Peru, but I don't know that 100% sure. And so, give me a little bit of background about yourself and your upbringing, and actually, and how old are you today, if I can ask?
I'm 27.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm quite young to do this. Obviously, macro is an old man's game, right? Or I would say middle-aged man's game, and I'm a young man playing in this arena. I'm not the only one, but definitely, there's definitely very few of us. Um, so I was born and raised in Washington. I was raised just north of Seattle, and I went to high school near Shoreline, Washington, and then I graduated. I decided to go to Gonzaga University. I thought about going to a more, I guess you call it, like elite university, because I definitely had the ACT scores and I was a very good test taker as a kid. But I didn't, and this kind of relates into my overall arc in finances. I didn't like the haughtiness and the I guess you could call it like ego and egocentrism of a lot of academia, and so I didn't want to be anywhere that was um, that had that sense to me. And so those higher level schools like Stanford just were automatically off the list. So I went to Gonzaga and I studied finance and entrepreneurship. And actually, I started off with a biology major, but I switched about halfway through because I was uh, I was initially interested in cell research and in epidemiology and virology, and especially in technologies like CRISPR. And so I had an internship at the Center for Infectious Disease Research, and we were doing basically like genome expression tests on tuberculosis, on and a couple other bacteria. And I found that it was really interesting work, but it there was something lacking in it, and it made me realize that that model of viewing the world, the academic and even like even scientific way of viewing the world, failed to account for human action, right? Because you can have a theoretical solution to something, but if people don't apply it in the right way, it won't work. And so that's when I started getting interested in finance and economics. And when I get interested in something, I usually go very, very deep into it. And so when I transitioned to finance as a degree, I started doing a vast amount of. I first read all the books, the basic finance books, and then I quickly found myself going down the gold bug rabbit hole. Austrian economics. I read Rothbard and Mises. And then I eventually found my way to basically what I would call modern macro, which is, Luke Gromen, Lynn Alden, these Brent Johnson, even like these people who have written or produced content that's quite applicable, especially to the way our modern economic system works. And so I was studying that for, I'd say 6 years or so, pretty intensively. And after studying for 6 years, I'd had a very, I had a very good grasp, especially for my age. And in 2021, I started writing on Reddit first, and then I moved to Twitter, and my writing started to go viral. And that was kind of a feedback loop that told me that I should continue this path. And so I was working at a fintech at the time after college, and I liked my job. It's a very good company. They have a good mission. And I was luckily working with startups mostly, and mostly software startups and tech founders. And so very, very smart people who were just trying to, make their app or their product launch correctly and trying to raise capital for it. But it was just not what I was meant to do. And I didn't want to work a 9 to 5. And so I kept writing and kept publishing content. And eventually I was able to quit my job and do this full time. And that was August of 2023.
So today you're independent and write online full time, or and if, how do you make your living today, if I can ask?
Yeah, sure. So today I make a living through I've a paid Substack, so you can go and look at my links on my Twitter bio. I've quite a few paid subs, and then I also have the YouTube, obviously, which brings in ad revenue, and then I have one. I only have a single sponsor right now for the YouTube, which is Blockstream, and they are a hardware wallet provider. They also have other technical products, but I mainly just talk about their hardware wallets on YouTube.
Well, I mean, congratulations. I mean, making I've done content marketing for many years. Started early in social media space back in 2009, and it's very hard. It's hard to make a living online. But I think the fact that you're doing it demonstrates that you found a way to communicate well with an audience, and that audience respects your writing and your opinion.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that I've definitely been able to convince and sway a lot of people over to my side, mainly because I do have a propensity for arguing. And the reason why is because my dad, as a kid, raised me to be very, very, I guess you could call it like self-critical of my own views. So always constantly questioning, because my father was a atmospheric science PhD,
Oh
and
wow,
he worked at Boeing, and he worked at NOAA for a brief stint. And so by the time I'm like 10, 11, he decided to basically like start arguing with me at the dinner table over every single topic. And so he'd give me a book to read, and then I'd have to argue with him about, what my views were on it. And so because he
that's
was
a tough
essentially
upbringing.
yeah. Yeah, intellectually, sure, but I mean, it was good for me, right? Because I really learned how to dissect my own points of view. And so when people would, have reservations, they'd say, "Oh, well, hey, you're saying all this issue with the debt. We can just delete the debt." And I'd say, "Well, that's a good question, but I've already thought of that, and you can't do that because the fundamental accounting equation is A equals L plus E, and that means in our financial system, every single asset is either liability or equity in some way to somebody else. And so your treasury bond that, or like let's say the treasury bonds that the US government owes, that's a liability to them, but it's an asset to a baby boomer who's in Ohio who owns them in his Roth IRA. And so if you delete them, or if you just say we're going to, default, then you destroy the asset that somebody else owns. And so it's not an easy way out. And so, things like that I had to consider, and kind of, I guess you could call it like self-criticize my own arguments before I even put them out there.
And uh, do you have siblings?
Yeah, I have three brothers. They're all older than me substantially. I'm the
And did your
youngest by
father put
17
them to
years.
the same rigor?
No, not to the same extent because I was the last one born, and I was the
I'm the
last.
youngest of four as well,
Okay. Oh wow, that's amazing.
but by
Yeah,
a
no.
good amount, actually, by about 7 years. So
Okay, mine is 17 years,
holy
so
cow!
it's a lot.
One marriage.
Yeah, my oldest brother is from another. My mom was married briefly to another guy, but all my other brothers are biological brothers. Yes.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
that's a long wow, 17 years between kids. That's that's a long time.
Yeah. It's like 17, 19, and 23 years difference between me and my brothers.
So you're 27. So you know, it's so hard to believe that the 2008 crash is getting close to 20 years. Because for
Hmm.
me, it almost feels like yesterday. And that was actually I suffered my first layoff in April of '09 ever during this period. But I guess you were you know you're about 10 maybe. So I don't know if you had much experience on. I mean, this was Occupy Wall Street, days and all that. So I don't know if that was on your radar or not at that age.
It was, and I would say the only reason it really was because my brother, my older brother, ran a real estate brokerage up here in Seattle, and he had been very successful actually. And in the wake of 2008, his little, real estate agency collapsed, and it's a long story, but essentially his partner had defrauded funds, and the IRS came after both of them, even though my brother hadn't done anything. But my brother was signatory on all the accounts. And
Right.
so they assumed that they were both liable when it was my brother had all this stuff hidden from him from his business partner. And so my brother going through all this and then constantly coming to the house and even moving in back home, and he was, at the time I was what, yeah, 11 or 12, and he's, 28, 29. For him to move back home after he'd been successful for 4 or 5 years in real estate was, pretty big hit to his ego. And so he was constantly talking about the real estate market. So I started learning about economics back then, but I would say it was like a cursory interest. Whereas in like 2015, 2016, as I grew older, it became much more of a focus.
And I'm just curious, your father, is he still work with NOAA or doing that kind of research?
No, he's retired. So both of my parents are yeah, now in their 70s. Again, my parents were very old when they had me. I was not expected to be born, right? So it was kind of like
I was a replacement choice for the family dog that my mother decided she didn't want.
yeah, I'm kind of the same way, right? So all my other brothers are born in the early 80s and late 70s, and I was born 97. So very, very
Yeah,
far in
well,
the
and
game.
both my two older brothers are 10 years older than me, but had a large influence on my growing up and what I wanted to go into and study. But yeah, um, and and uh, and where did the um, nickname Peruvian Bull come from? Your family heritage, something else?
Yeah, so my like I said, my father is he's American and he is born in Utah. I think in a city, yeah, it's a city called Bountiful, which is right near Salt Lake. And he's Scandinavian and he was Mormon. And then when he was young, he kind of rebelled from his strict Mormon family and he traveled Latin America. And then he came back and actually he met my mom at the University of Utah in the mid 70s. And my mom was Peruvian by birth. And her ancestry is actually mostly Spanish Italian because her parents were recent immigrants from Spain and Italy, or her grandparents, excuse me. But she was born in Peru and she obviously had Peruvian citizenship, and so they got married and they had obviously three kids and then or two of my brothers and then me. And when I was thinking of a name on Reddit back in 2019, when I first started, I guess you could call it like browsing or you know maybe even shit posting. I wanted something that was unique and that was also specific to me. And so I thought, well, there's not many people that are like Peruvian or half Peruvian like I am, and so I'll put in Peruvian, and then bull for finance, and that's where the name spouted
Yeah.
from.
No, it's great. Actually, it's very. I think it's a good name. It's easy to remember. Have you had a chance to travel to Peru?
Yeah, I have. It's been a while though. I haven't been to Peru since about 2014. I last year I was living in Colombia for about 9 months,
Okay.
um,
Well, where?
but in Medellin and in Santa Marta.
Okay. Well, wonderful. And what were you doing down there?
Well, so that's kind of like part of the, I guess you'd call it the story, right? When I quit my job in August of 2023, I'd quit a high-paying tech job, and I could have gotten work at BlackRock or State Street or any of the asset managers. I mean, I had good grades, and my
You're
coworkers
you're,
liked
you're
me. I
missing
could have
out
gotten
on
referrals.
some good salary money.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no, I totally was. I had friends who
Well,
left there and were
you
making.
still are.
Yeah, but I believe in the mission more than I believe in temporary gains, and I know in the long run, if I'm able to scale this business, it'll make up for it. So, um, I prefer it this way. But yeah, no, when I quit my job in August of 2023, I wanted to kind of get out of my comfort zone, get out of where I'd been living in Seattle near Green Lake, and I was talking to one of my close friends who's a Bitcoiner and a blogger, Ben Wehrman, and Ben had been to the Bitcoin conference, and I'd actually been with him a couple months before, and we had made some friends, and all the friends had said you should go to Colombia because we were thinking about traveling abroad to El Salvador for the Bitcoin ecosystem and just the story that's happening there. But everyone told us no, Colombia has way more fun things to do. El Salvador is a pretty small country; you're going to get bored, and so we traveled there in September of 2023, and we returned in like July of 2024. So we were there for about 9 months.
Nice. Well, actually, that's a great segue. So, and because the first topic I wanted to talk to, and a little bit, just because of what's happened in the last couple of days, is it looks like Bitcoin is finally broken out of what everyone's been waiting on since January. Who knows? It's up about 7% this week. We'll see where closes today, and or well, actually, it never close technically, um, but talk to me about your view of what's been happening with Bitcoin as an asset class, and I'm also interested to hear your views of investing in Bitcoin or putting value in Bitcoin versus gold, and also you know what you think of Ethereum at this point as an investment, because I'm really confused on Ethereum. I mean, I understand its value and use in software development and blockchain, but I'm having a hard time seeing it as the same investment class as Bitcoin, especially when it's kind of limitless in terms of how much of it can be created. But maybe there's something I'm misunderstanding.
You mean in terms of Ethereum
Yeah,
and the amount that
yeah,
can be created? Okay. Well,
and I know
so I
there's a lot there. So
yeah, no, absolutely. So I would say, I mean, the Bitcoin story is a very, very interesting one, right? Because Bitcoin kind of emerged on the scene in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And it was essentially the brainchild of these, or this one cypherpunk who had been reading and keeping track with tons of earlier variations of digital cash, right? They had eCash. There was a couple other iterations that kind of worked, kind of didn't. And then his innovation was the proof of work system and the difficulty adjustment, which allowed Bitcoin to basically secure its own network and to use game theory along with just, like you call it like brute force encryption and extremely strong encryption to secure the network. And that was really the genius part, right? Was making it so any attacker would not only have to spend an inordinate amount of money and time and energy, but also that the network itself would have incentives to fight back against that. Right, the network would have a way of forking itself, and it's almost like a hydra, right? Like an anti-fragile system, where the more you attack it and the harder you stamp down on it, the more decentralized and the more robust it can become. And so for that reason, it's a very, very, very unique asset, right? I would truly say it's like no other financial asset or monetary asset I've ever looked at. And so when I started doing research on it in 2020 and 2021, I very quickly grasped the value play, and I started buying in heavily. And I actually used to be a gold bug before that. So I was a very, very strong gold bug. I actually lost my life savings in gold call options. And I've admitted this on other podcasts too, in 2020. And that was a rude awakening for me because I thought that the gold miners would rip within 1 to 2 years because of the coming inflation. And I got the inflation call right. And I got you know, the overall gold picture right, but the gold picture didn't materialize till 2 or 3 years after my options positions. And so all my options had expired by the time that, we saw February 2024 gold price really start to
You
move.
you were right, just early.
Yeah, I was too early, and I put in, 90% of that life savings into call options, and because I wanted I wanted high risk, high reward derivative exposure, and so
Yeah,
it all got ground to zero. Basically, I sold it for like pennies on the dollar, so I lost my shirt on that trade.
I'm I'm very sorry to hear that.
It was a good experience though, because here's the other thing is it's funny. I've actually thought about like what would happen if it actually played out. I was young, and to be honest, I was a bit arrogant. I thought I understood much more about the world than I really did at the time. And this is only 5 years ago, right? But I even at that age, I was like, I've done more research than anybody. I've been listening to podcasts obsessively. I've been, you know, talking to economists. I've been reading books. I know more. I'm right about this. I'm going to make $1 million off of 20 grand was my rough calculation, and it completely went the other way, and that was kind of a humbling experience and made me realize, wow, maybe things don't they're not as simple, or I don't understand it as much as I should, and maybe my ego got in the way of this trade, and so I had to kind of take a step back and
I
reevaluate
think this
myself.
is I mean, I personally, I mean, I've never been, you know, I wouldn't say rich or anything like that. I've not been, I've been, you know, had less income than I would like at times, and not necessarily teetering on the brink or anything like that. But I've been in tech and for most of my career, 35 years, mostly. I mean, pretty much all in the Northeast. I spent a little bit of time, working uh, part-time contracts work in Silicon Valley, and all of my, most of my view of Silicon Valley has been from the outside looking in. But it does seem, I do feel that, you know, anyone, on the young side, probably under 30, that experiences a huge windfall early in their life. I don't think it helps them, have a good grasp of reality after that, unless they experience a really bad downfall. But those that have, the super rich and many that are, I mean, my God, it's a little bit. It's just hard to get my head around right now the fact that Meta is giving out sports like salaries for AI researchers. It's hard to really like. Oh my God, somebody's getting paid 100 million to for a regular job, not to play football.
Yeah, no, it's incredible, right? And when you meet those kinds of people, you kind of like there's a categorical difference between the people who had to grind and earn and just like get to become a millionaire or multimillionaire through sweat equity, and the people who kind of like, I guess you could call it like lucked their way there, right? That they just hit a couple lucky trades, and they all assume that this is like they're due to their own brilliance, and they kind of have an ego and just almost also like an insecurity about them, where they kind of realize that they didn't really earn it in the same way, and
I mean,
so
some
those
of
people
them
are not as
I
fun to
think
talk
earned
to.
it. Some of them, had a brilliant idea and brilliant application, and flooded with investment very early. So I'm not uh, you know um, begrudging them, their success. But I think whether you earned it or not, it's just but experiencing that kind of financial windfall early in your career and your upbringing. Because I mean, look, I'm 54. It's and I would definitely say that a lot of my views and outlook. I mean, a lot of my outlook is not changed all that much, but my understanding the world has changed, a great deal, over the last 20 to 25 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key part in macro and in life in general is to keep an open mind and to keep adjusting your worldview for the facts that are presented to you, right? So, if you had told me in 2019, 2018, when I was, I guess, a couple of years already into researching macro, that the Fed could hike rates to 5% and then keep them there without easing, that I would tell you that that's impossible. There's no way. And now with my deeper understanding of monetary plumbing and their usage of a reverse repo and the TGA and the SLR ratios and capital ratios and all these other ways that they can add liquidity to the system without like on balance sheet showing an expansion, um, I wouldn't have believed you. But now it's clearly that's what they've done, and so they're one of the problems that we face, right, when we're trying to analyze what's going to happen is a lot of times people underestimate the powers that be. It's this perpetual battle between are the people in power, are they idiots or are they geniuses, right? Because they can't be both.
I'm
There are
not
some
so sure.
people.
I think they can be both at times. But let me, before we go get off topic a little bit on, well, I mean, on going out down different, economic discussion. Let's finish with Bitcoin a little bit. And I'm saying, I'm sure, we could probably spend 4 hours talking about Bitcoin, but if you can, and I know you're not a financial advisor, um, but let me ask you if you can, and if you have an opinion. If you don't have an opinion, that's fine as well. But if you had $100, to invest, and you're advising a friend, put the $100 in a checking account or a savings account, or put it into Bitcoin, or put it into Ethereum, or put it into gold. Um, what would you say today with that? How would you advise that friend, if at all?
So, I mean, it would depend on what the risk tolerance and the age and their income and expenses and everything.
Let's
But
say
I would,
they're not worried about losing the $100 at all,
sure, then I would say Bitcoin, unequivocally.
and so why?
Yeah. So the reason why is because, for one, like I said, Bitcoin has these incredible intrinsic properties that make it essentially like a digital form of gold that is almost unhackable and unbreakable, right? It's anti-fragile. The harder a nation state tries to crack down on it, the stronger it becomes. And more importantly, Bitcoin solves the what I would call like the transactability dilemma that gold would fail to solve. So gold is a great store of value, right? It only inflates at 2% a year. You can't really produce it artificially. They've tried. There's a neutron collider that's made a couple atoms of gold, but it's at the expense of millions and millions of dollars. And so that's just unsustainable, obviously. And until we get to 0 point energy or fusion energy or some sort of like infinite electricity source, we don't have a way of producing that easily. And so that means that gold is, because of its other properties, obviously, like the inability to rust, inability to decay, its softness, and general usability as a metal for not only dental and technical appliances like in silicon chips, but also in obviously coinage. It makes gold a great monetary, or you could say store of value, right? Especially for a pre-digital age. The problem with gold arises when you're actually trying to transact it, because gold is it's dying from its own success. It's too valuable. And so because it's too valuable and too scarce, you have to use tiny flakes of it to pay for small transactions. And it turns out that 99% of your transactions happen under $2,500 and 90% are under $1,000. And so in an economy where microtransactions are the bulk of are basically all the transactions that happen, it's unfeasible to walk around paying flakes of gold for your coffee and then for some snacks and then for a beanie baby or whatever you want to buy. And that's where Bitcoin can solve that dilemma, because Bitcoin can be broken down into 100 millionths of a single coin for transactability, and it also can be done digitally anywhere in the world, right? If I have a current account balance with you, and we're living in the 1800s, I have to physically settle that balance by shipping you gold, right? If I have a trade deficit or trade surplus, I have to receive the balance of that in gold in payment for the items that are owed, right? Or if I try to redeem, let's say I'm France and I'm trying to redeem my US dollars for gold in 1965, I have to physically send warships to the New York harbor to pick up real gold, right? Because everything is physical. And in a modern digitized age, that just seems unfeasible, especially with the speed of transactions. And so Bitcoin solves that problem because I can send you Bitcoin anywhere in the world and it can be secured by 3 blocks in 30 minutes. And essentially it's a uncensorable, unhackable, unbreakable transaction that nobody can really stop. So that's Bitcoin's genius.
So there's a couple directions I want to go, and I'm making a bunch of notes and with arrows and question marks. Um, I want to talk about the U.S. debt. I don't know how far I want to go down this rabbit hole right now, but because you're talking about gold, I have a question for you, which is a fundamental question: Is our is the U.S.'s financial mess and out of control debt a direct result of Nixon taking us off the gold standard?
Yes, it's part of it, but I would say it's more complex, right? Because
I'm
everyone
sure
all
it is.
yeah, no, everyone points the finger at at Nixon, and everyone blames him as being such a horrible president for doing it. But really, his hand was forced. There was no real solution, and the entire collapse of Bretton Woods was actually predicted about 11 years earlier by a Belgian American economist named Robert Triffin. In February of 1960, he went in front of Congress and he basically laid out the case that the Bretton Woods system was terminal, and his argument essentially became known as Triffin's dilemma. And the dilemma is essentially this: the US is the world reserve currency holder. They issue the world reserve currency, which is the US dollar, and other nations need to use the US dollar in form of trade, as forex reserves for cross-border loans, etc. And in the post-war economy, especially into the 19 later into the 1960s and 70s, the rest of the world started to globalize rapidly, right? Because initially it was just in 1945 the US made up 15% of the world population and 60% of world GDP, and we had over 50% of the above ground gold reserves in the entire world because we'd storehoused all the European gold during the war. And so it made sense for us to be the world's reserve currency. And not many other people needed it outside of us and Europe. And so we didn't really have a supply and demand imbalance. But as the rest of the world began to globalize, especially, Southeast Asia, with the rest of Europe in the 1960s, then that created demand pressure for more and more US dollars. And the way you supply demand pressure under a fixed, peg system, right, which is the Bretton Woods system was a fixed peg, then you have to issue more dollars. And so the US had been doing that. They'd been issuing dollars for decades, and by the late 60s, the the French finance minister Gerard d'Estaing, and I'm sure I'm butchering that, had done the calculus along with Charles de Gaulle and realized that the U.S. had issued about 2.5 to 3 times as many dollars as was justified by the reserve ratio of $35 an ounce. And so what do? Is they call in the gold, and that forces Nixon within like 5 years from 1965 to about mid 71, 5 to 6 years, half of the U.S. gold reserves were drained. And so if you continue down that path, obviously the U.S. would run out of gold, and then we'd completely lose Bretton Woods. And so his solution was more of like a temporary stopgap, which is let's just break the gold window, let's keep the rest of the gold here, and then let's just make it a free floating fiat currency, and let's find other ways like the petrodollar system to ensure that there's dollar purchasers. But
let, let
what
me let me back up
sure.
for a second and just try to. And again, I'm a novice, neophyte when it comes to this, so I'm asking basic questions for my own understanding. But I'm going to guess that if I don't understand it, then hopefully there's probably a lot of people listening that don't understand it either. Um, with the in the 50s, 60s, as let's say Southeast Asia's growing economies and the demand for dollars, what was the need? Why did the U.S. Fed need to keep printing dollars to meet that requirement? What was the what would have what's the what happens if they don't increase that printing? Because doesn't that then reduce the value of the dollars that are out there, printing more, putting them out there more?
Yeah, so this was essentially right the dilemma that Triffin offered to the global or well to Congress in 1960 is he said, look, here's the problem. There's out external demand for the US dollar, right? And only the Fed can print it. And we have two options. Either we print to meet that demand or we don't. And if we don't, which is the first option that you just laid out, then there's not enough global liquidity to fund, the demand, which means the global monetary system begins to seize up. And so the way that would play out would be essentially like deflation, right? You'd see all these dollar-based loans in Europe. They can't earn, these corporations now suddenly can't earn dollars, and so they start defaulting. And the local currencies have to start maybe printing their own currency in order to buy dollars on a foreign exchange market to get their hands on dollars so that their local, industrial manufacturer or that their local bank can have enough dollar liquidity to finance itself. And if it doesn't, obviously, then it just defaults on those loans and those loans go to zero. And like I laid out in the very beginning, A equals L plus E. If you let any liability default, you let an asset default, which means the system as a whole shrinks, and that's called deflation.
Now, let me ask you a fundamental. I mean, this is kind of a fundamental economic question. If What is wrong with that? What is wrong with allowing for those defaults to happen, allowing for deflation to occur? And now, is it a downward spiral, or is there a point of equilibrium?
Well, there's obviously a point of equilibrium that eventually lower prices stop getting lower prices and liquidity will flood back into the system. The question is how much pain is required to get there. And the fundamental issue with right our modern fiat system, especially post 1913, is that it's our all money is blown into existence, and so money is debt. And so if you allow debt destruction, you're essentially allowing monetary destruction, which is what we saw in the 1930s. And so if you allow a let's say 20% drop in the value of the assets of the bank, and the bank is fractionally reserved, and there's a bank run, well, only a fraction of the people are actually going to get their cash out, and then the rest of them will be left with nothing but empty promises and maybe bank equity if they're lucky. And if that happens over and over and over again, the money supply contracts, which adds to the deflationary problem. And so you would see basically rapid deflation until everything is down basically to the value of cash in the system, which is usually around 10 to 20% for most, let's say early 1900 banking
So,
systems.
but isn't this the isn't it? Aren't we in the problem we are because we have, you know based on a our economy and a functioning democracy and the way we run the world. I mean, the problem with our system, and not that I mean, it is the best system that we have, but it's all predicated on continued growth. And it's very, very hard to have continued growth all the time, and want to minimize the pain of some. I mean, this goes back to the decisions back in 2008, which I think that the bailouts were the completely incorrect thing to do, and they should have let the banks fail, the ones that were over their heads, and racking up much more debt than they could manage.
Yeah, absolutely. And this system again, it's emerged because of the. I guess we can even loop it back to the gold transactability problem we talked about in the beginning, right? Since gold is really hard to use because it's so valuable, it's really hard to use in microtransactions. It made sense for people to say, "Hey, I'll store it at a centralized counterparty. You give me an IOU, and I'll go trade that IOU. And then if somebody wants to come in and settle the gold for the IOU, they can do that. But if they just want to hold on to the IOU, they can." And so that that process gave birth to the modern fiat banking, fractional banking standard, and we were just kind of stuck on that, and we're still stuck on that, which means that our entire system, it's requiring ever, you could call it like ever present inflation and ever present growth in order to continue to perpetuate itself, because the interest on that debt that's loaned into existence needs to be paid off continually. And so if it's not going to come from fundamental growth, it's going to
It's
come
the
from
whole
inflation.
reason for Trump wanting to get rid of Powell at this point. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
so something I wrote down that I actually hadn't thought until you and I started talking, and I'm I'm wondering if there's some in deep state goal. But based on all this, would we be better off than moving to a Bitcoin standard?
I think so, but I think it would take. There's a lot of steps that need to happen before we get there, right? And a lot of the Bitcoiners,
And how does that avoid the same problem of printing more dollars than we maybe have Bitcoin reserves, or with the Bitcoin reserves, is it just all so more transparent that it doesn't take a finance minister in France to do some detective work to figure out that the U.S. Is printing more than they have gold reserves?
so I would say that the Bitcoin, a Bitcoin standard can come in several different forms, right? There could be a form of a Bitcoin standard where you put your Bitcoin in a bank and they issue you some sort of IOU, and the IOU could either be on a blockchain, on a decentralized blockchain, or it could be on a completely centralized ledger. And unfortunately, if people trust that and enough people adopt it, it could become a form of money, right? And that would kind of, you're right, it would eliminate some of the benefits of using a full Bitcoin standard. The benefit with Bitcoin though is because it's digital, you could, in theory, demand withdrawal whenever you wanted, and you could also obviously put it in there whenever you wanted. And if they give you the address of your, the base layer address of your Bitcoin, you can check it at any time at any time anywhere in the world to make sure that the Bitcoin's still there. And so people could audit the bank themselves, which is a completely novel function, right? Under a gold standard, you give the bank your gold and it just disappears into the vault, and you just have to trust that they have it. And they can audit themselves, they can hire an auditing firm, but in the end of the day, the system is based on trust, and Bitcoin is the first one that's not fully based on trust. Now, the second option I would say, which is better, obviously, is a fully backed Bitcoin standard where you don't have an IOU except in the form of a layer two instrument like Lightning or Liquid, and then you just settle that every couple of days on the base chain.
Would we have to peg the dollar to Bitcoin for this to work?
Well, if you wanted the dollar to be redeemable in Bitcoin, you would. But the dollar in that case would survive in a much different environment, right? Because it would that would reinstate Triffin's dilemma again. So, we talked about the one side of Triffin's dilemma, right? Where there's external demand for the currency, there's a centralized issuer, and you don't issue enough. So that the global monetary system begins to seize up as if it's like it's a global Great Depression, is essentially what I would call it. And actually, ironically, that's what Triffin thought would happen. He thought, if you read his papers, he thought that we would have a deflationary outcome. He's like, there's no way this doesn't end in deflation. What he didn't expect is that the US would actually go along with the other side of the deal, which is to print enough dollars to fund the demand, even if the demand is greater than what's justified by the reserve ratio.
So
And so
he didn't expect the U.S. government to do something that was probably not ethical or correct.
no, he didn't. No, which is again, this is the I guess called the idealism of economists, right? He thought that it would end in a deflationary outcome, that the U.S. would stay true to their gold standard, that we'd essentially follow the UK's 1920s playbook of sticking to the gold peg even when it was extremely harmful, because the UK had done the same thing. They went off the gold standard in 1914. They fought the war, and then in 1920 and 21, they started to reinstate the gold standard, and they tried to do it at the same peg of, I think it was, 1 troy ounce for £4 or something that they had before the war. But of course, they'd inflated the money supply by 100%, 200%. And so the real exchange rate was somewhere north of 8 or 9, and they tried to peg it back at 4. And so that caused a recession in the UK and a deflation and contraction in the money supply much, much sooner than it happened in the US.
Now, but I guess going back to the way our economy works, it we have to. I mean, it almost seems like the UK went through what it had to go through. It went through that that depression during the 20s. It went through its recession because you have to go through those recessions to get back to a growth point, that a growth point that's not artificial.
You do, and that's why business cycles have existed for thousands of years. I mean, there's even accounts in Leviticus of debt jubilees and debt cycles. You know, even dating back to, like I said, the ancient Israelites and the Canaanites and the Philistines. This is almost like a human uh, a human action, right? What Mises would call a human action cycle that has just continued perpetuate itself, because there's always a boom, there's always excessive exuberance, there's always excessive borrowing and lending, and then it always comes home to roost. Some of those projects aren't profitable, they start to default, the economy rolls over, and then that all that bad capital gets flushed out with the bad companies, and the ground is set for the new companies. The problem is the central banks as they exist today do not want to see that kind of economic pain. And increasingly, the system is more and more sensitive to any form of economic pain whatsoever. Right? I mean, we had a huge regional banking crisis after just a few months of the taper in March of 2023, and we had major currencies like the British pound and the yen blowing up in September 2022 after just 5 months of tapering and reducing US dollar liquidity. So the system is like, it's so dependent that the time now between a taper and a crisis is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, just because the leverage is getting ratcheted up higher and higher and higher on every single entity in the system.
And so I guess maybe this then brings us to the state of the U.S. debt, because it in my mind uh, it's an amount and a situation that's not solvable, that's unsolvable, and unfortunately it's the state of the last 30-35 years of lack of financial leadership, that's put us in this place. And unfortunately, we don't. I think we'd be in different financial situations if our government was held accountable for the financial decisions they made. But it always ends up being somebody else's problem, and I'll be long dead before Except though they don't seem to care very much about their grandchildren. um, so where are we today? um, I mean, and then with this big beautiful bill, which completely seems to go against what Trump ran on in terms of keeping the debt at least in check. That does look like to it adds. It will add, I don't think it'll add to it as fast as maybe being predicted. I think it's going to take a few years for the costs of or the impacts of changes in healthcare and stuff to play out. I don't think whatever they're estimating is probably going to be anywhere near close. Could be a lot higher, could be a lot lower. But where you know if you were in charge, what should we be doing? What would be the appropriate thing to be doing? And is there anything? And are there choices that you know are there choices that are better or less, that put us in a better position without causing the pain that is necessary to level the playing field and start again? It just seems like that's it's how the system works. We don't want to deal with it. It is the worst thing that we can you want to think about. But you know, what I've worried about for many years, I'm starting to think maybe because the U.S. has the reserve, it won't happen. But like, to me, a Greece situation can happen here. And Greece is better off for it now. I mean, Greece is now back in a growth stage, but they had to go through that pain.
Yeah, and Iceland had the same thing with the 2008 financial crisis, where they didn't really do bailouts. They allowed many of their banks to fail, and what happened is that they had a sharper downturn, obviously, but then they had a sharper recovery, and they were able to actually get to positive GDP growth by like fourth quarter of 2011, which was much faster than a lot of the other countries, especially when you adjust for inflation. So the allowing a recession, allowing some economic pain to play out is actually a good thing. It's same thing with going to the gym and thinking that you can build muscle without going through some physical effort and some strain and a little bit of pain. It's just impossible. You can't. And so the excesses of the boom cycle need to be wiped out by the, I guess, call it the downturn or the the depression of the crash. And so that's just the cycle of human history. As to where what or what I would do with our current debt situation, I would say it's pretty grim. It's pretty difficult because we're at 36-37 trillion dollars of total federal debt. We're already at $2 trillion of annual stimuluses, um, which is already 6 to 7% of GDP, without a war or without a major crisis that we're, I guess, bailing ourselves out of. Um, there's falling tax receipts for the last few years, especially in terms of percent of GDP, and along with these provisions in the bill, that's just going to become more and more extreme. And the bill also obviously includes another $2 trillion of spending over 10 years. So that's $200 billion a year additional. And then add on to all of that the $1.1 trillion of interest expense, which interest expense just passed back in mid-May of this year. It passed defense spending as this, and now it's the second most expensive line item on the Treasury's expenditure list. And so,
So let's for argument's sake, uh, let's say Powell resigns tomorrow, and Trump appoints somebody new, and they drop the interest rate 3 points as he's asking for, so like 1.5, 2%. So that would reduce the interest payments on the debt significantly. I mean, like 75, 80%. But um, but it does seem with that kind of low interest rate, then we're going to be stoking uh, more irrational exuberance.
we would, but the system requires more and more liquidity and more speculation and more asset price appreciation for it to continue, right? So this is like my contention with people who think that there's this easy way out of this debt problem. Well, for one, like we said, we can't delete or just default on the debt because every liability is someone else's asset. And let's say you just try to reduce the situation on the fiscal side. So you just say, okay, well, we're not going to actually default on the debt, but what we can do is we're going to cut government spending so much that we're going to go from deficits to surpluses, and we're going to use the surplus to pay off the debt. Okay, let's say you do that. Well, you're going to get rid of the deficit, which is 7% of GDP, and then you're going to have to cut deeper, probably almost about the same amount. And so that means 14% of GDP spending or GDP in total is now gone. And the reason why is because GDP includes government spending as a net additive portion of the equation. So if you reduce government spending de facto, you reduce GDP. That's just how the equation works. And so reducing the fiscal side means that you'll have a contraction, you'll have a recession immediately because now suddenly government workers are laid off, government contracts with Boeing and Lockheed are all canceled, healthcare programs are canceled, Medicare, Medicaid programs will be canceled. You'll probably obviously have to go after Social Security as well. So a bunch of stimulative spending that was being sent to seniors direct payments is now gone. It would cause a recession in very short order, right? And that recession could easily blossom into even like a depression or like a mini depression, we can call it. So there's no really easy way out. And printing the money is essentially the, I guess you could call it like the least immediately painful way to handle the problem, but it's also obviously detrimental long term because it erodes the dollar's value on the foreign exchange markets. It erodes it here at home, and erodes faith in the currency, and just speeds up our end game of this world reserve
So
currency
so
status.
so maybe you can help illustrate the issue in relation to Japan's situation. which is, and again, not having the best full understanding myself, but knowing that their debt is about 200% of GDP. And I there's a figure I saw, a couple months ago or something that said, as long as the U.S. keeps the debt within, like, I don't know if it was either 80% of GDP or 120% of GDP or something like that, that it could maintain a working ratio. Um, but and I don't know, and I'm not quite sure, and I don't completely understand the impact that a 200% uh, debt to GDP ratio that Japan has had, how that's impacted its own economy for good or for bad over, say, the last 2 decades versus the U.S. And are we just following that same playbook and going toward down that path?
Well, so Japan is another option, right? I guess you could call it for the monetary end game, because Japan has faced essentially the same or similar problems that the US is facing now with demographics and debt, but they're just like 20 or 30 years ahead of the curve. So, in the wake of the asset price bubble that collapsed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Japanese central bank finally was able to wrestle control away from the Ministry of Finance and gain what I would call basically monetary autonomy. And so they started off with bringing interest rates to the zero bound in 1999, and then they brought about the first version of QE in 2001 in March. And then in 2010, they continued with more QE right after the financial crisis. And then in 2013, they started QQE, which was essentially the it was like QE on steroids, even buying real estate ETFs and equity ETFs and corporate bonds. And of course, they started with yield curve control in 2016 in September, after Bernanke had flown there in July to help them formulate a new monetary policy, because they were trying to escape this liquidity trap and this debt overhang that they themselves had created. And the issue with the Japan is that instead of allowing the system to fully deflate and to let the excesses wash themselves out, they essentially zombified the entire system so that all the debt would perpetuate, because at 0% interest rates, right, rolling it over is free and the money is free. So you can just borrow money again to pay off the maturing loan. And a lot of companies that should not be in existence are able to maintain existence. And the Japanese federal government, which at 260% debt to GDP, which is at where it's at currently, and the private sector, which is at 180% debt to GDP, are able to perpetuate themselves in that environment. But the problem is you pin your entire monetary policy to the zero bound, and it's very, very hard to move away from that. And that's why the yen started blowing out, because the interest rates were pinned so low, and the Fed started hiking, and so the carry trade opened up and just pulled the currency away from away from 100 yen to the dollar up to 150. But it limits your options, because once you're that indebted, there's really no easy way to hike your way out of anything.
So maybe can you go into more on what Japan's current situation is today with its debt and interest rate, and is it moving in a positive direction, or is it still just a perpetuated zombified state?
Sure. So I actually produced a mini documentary about this on my YouTube channel. You can, if you look up Peruvian Bull on YouTube, you'll find my most recent video was about this.
We'll,
But
we'll add that. We'll add that link to the notes.
absolutely, absolutely. So, and that video actually traveled to Japan and met with Weston Nakamura, who's a former Goldman trader, and now he's a macro writer and analyst on Substack. But Japan was essentially caught in this trap of 0% interest rates, 0% inflation, and essentially infinity QE and infinity yield curve control. And as they continued down this path in the 2010s and into the early to mid 2020s, they were seeing an increasing zombification of the stock and bond markets. And so, for example, the Bank of Japan now today owns over 55% of all JGBs, Japanese government bonds, It owns 90% or more of most of the long end, and it owns over 100% of certain issuances of the 10-year JGB. And the way that's possible is you buy up all the bonds on auction from the Treasury as a central bank, and then you loan them out in the repo markets. And so on paper, you own 108% of, let's say, like the May
So can I
2024.
can I stop you there? So is that similar to the Fed owning like 7 to 8 trillion of the current debt today?
It's similar in kind. It's not similar in scale. So the Fed owns, approximately 20%, right, of the total treasury market, and the BOJ owns 55%. So the BOJ is just much, much more extreme version of what, the Fed has
Now,
accomplished.
so maybe help me understand something, maybe for listeners as well. What is the um, is it technically, is the U.S. government then technically own that debt, or, and if it does, why can't they just uh, erase it, or not worry about collecting it?
You mean like could they order the BOJ to simply like delete the debt that's on their balance sheet and then the BOJ can just print?
Well, or the U.S. I mean, what's if the U.S. owns 7 to 8? How can the U.S. government both own, uh, be the holder of the debt and owe the debt at the same time? That's what I'm trying to wrap my head around in terms of, say, the 7 to 8 trillion or 20%.
Well, remember, a central bank technically isn't part of the government, right? It's a independent entity, and actually, it's board of governors, and especially for the Fed, right? The actual chairman
What do we
has to be
call it if
appointed.
it's not part? It's neither the
It's
government nor
called
the private sector nor the
it's
public
called
sector.
it's called a public-private partnership. But you're right; it is in many ways it is an extension of the government, and it's a I guess you call it like an unholy union of the government and the banking system. And so it's not
We
really
should put that
accountable
one
to
on a
either.
T-shirt.
Yeah.
An
Yeah.
unholy union.
Well, that's what I would call it, right? It's pretty insidious. And the issue with allowing the central bank to swallow up so much of the bond market, with allowing the BOJ to eat 80, 50% of the total bond market and 80 or 90% of the 10-year and 20-year, and then over 100% of certain issuances, like I said, is even if you like, let's say you go forward with your strategy, and let's say you delete the debt that the government already owes or owes to that to the central bank. Well, at 0%, they weren't paying interest on that debt anyways. They were just borrowing new debt to pay off the principal and the principal payments from that original debt. But now you're sending a signal to the market that the central bank is just going to eat as much of the debt as possible, right? And it's going to eat unlimited amounts of the debt. And so there's no real reason for you to own the bonds other than for you to own them until the central bank comes in and buys them from you. And so the link between the central bank and the treasury becomes stronger and stronger as they tie themselves together in what I called in one of my Substack pieces a suicide pact. And so this suicide pact means the
It's
two
like a
orbiting.
Thelma and Louise, driving off the cliff.
Exactly, exactly. Or you could call it like in physics, when two black holes near each other, they start to spin around each other and they create gravitational waves, right? That's essentially what's happening. You're having these two entities, one that can borrow money and one that can print money and lend, and you have them approaching each other and ever tighter feedback loop and proximity, which makes it so that all the other players of the market start to get washed out. So again, you look at the 10-year JGB where they were doing yield curve control in September, October, November of 2023. There were weeks where the 10-year did not trade at all because no market participant needed to trade it or wanted to trade it, because at 0% rates and with the central bank buying infinity amount, why would you even buy it if you can't make a spread on it? And why would you buy it if you know that it's not going to be worth any more money in 10 years than it is today? So there's no reason to buy that in terms of yield.
So if Powell resigns and Trump gets his way and he gets the interest rate reduced, are we not then are we just not are we not headed in the same direction as Japan at this point?
In some ways, yes, but the difference is that Japan is not a world reserve currency holder, and Japan has a current account surplus, and we have a current account deficit. So we have a lot more to lose, especially if we lose reserve currency status than Japan does, because not many foreign people own JGBs, right? Not many foreigners own Japanese equities. With one of the feedback loops that we talked about in the beginning with Driffin's dilemma is that because the fact that the world demands dollars for global liquidity and for global trade, they they earn dollars through all those mechanisms we discussed before, through trade, through finance, through cross-border loans, and whatever dollars they don't use to settle trade balances or to settle invoices or debt, they store as cash. And what's the best thing to do with the excess cash? Well, with especially US dollar cash, you want to invest it in US markets. And so all this money that these foreigners earn flow back into US equities, US bonds, US treasuries, and that means that a large chunk of our treasuries and our stocks and our bonds are owned by foreigners. It's actually now more than 100% of GDP. So, over 100% of our GDP, we have a net negative international investment position, meaning foreigners own more assets of ours as a percent of GDP than we own of theirs. And it's by 100%. So we own, a couple $1 trillion worth of foreign assets, and foreigners own something like $29 trillion of American assets. So,
Which creates its own security questions and problems.
well,
Um,
yeah. So this is Dollar Endgame. I don't know if you finished the book, but this is the kind of nightmare scenario I lay out in Dollar Endgame, which is if the U.S. loses reserve currency status, which again, it's a big if. Fair. Like it's very hard to find another reserve currency. Fine. Okay. But let's just say we do. If we do, and these foreigners no longer have needs for US dollar liquidity, then they no longer really have needs to park their liquidity into a US dollar based asset. And then that means a lot of the guaranteed buyers that have been coming in for the last 40, 50 years for US equities and US bonds and US treasuries are now going to disappear. And when those buyers disappear, obviously, the supply and the market dynamics will reflect that, and so we could see a massive deflation, or you could call it like a stock market correction in the U.S. And then the Fed would again be forced to decide: do you want to allow the S&P to fall 30% within a year, or do you want to print? And their response every single time has been to print.
and well, can you maybe help me understand the relationship between the printing amount of printing and the interest rate and the interest rates effect on the bond market? Well, what I can, I mean, I guess what I could make an argument that okay, the U.S. equities market is attractive because of the technology that's coming out of Silicon Valley, because of the growth of Nvidia and Google and companies like that, and that's more attractive than other equity markets around the world. So I could see that as an argument. Is Does reducing the interest rate reduce the amount that foreigners can earn on the bonds, on U.S. bonds?
Yeah, it does, but again, it's not it usually comes with a lag, obviously, and it also comes with it depends on the tenor of the bond that they're investing in. Because with the Fed, if the Fed just moves the Fed funds rate, which is the overnight, call loan rate between unsecured between banks and the Fed, um, then that lowers the extreme short end of the curve, and usually the rest of the curve will follow suit. But that's why they usually have to do QE, is because in order to make the yield curve and the short and the Fed funds rate align with each other, then you have to run QE and purchase those bonds to drive the yields down and to kind of normalize, you call it like bond market policy with banking policy, which is the Fed funds rate. So you have to do both at once. And the issue is if you do QE again, you're going to cause another inflationary wave. And if you don't do QE again, then you're going to cause more interest expense and more debt growth, you could say, and that will eventually cause QE to be restarted again because there's just not enough demand in the system to handle the exponential supply of U.S. Treasury bonds that will have to be issued if we're going to go forward with our current debt path.
From an economist's point of view, so just thinking about it from a forget about the good or the bad side of all this. Is this just a grand 50-year experiment that's never been done before, and we really just don't know enough on what on how it all, what the results are, or where the options are, or what the end game is, as you say?
Yeah, well, I would say in some ways this is new, right? Because they're inventing new ways of monetary easing, and they're inventing new ways to
I mean,
use
it's
the.
amazing for as long as we've had civilization that we're still coming up with new ways, new manners of economics.
Yeah, absolutely. And but I would say it's a new kind of economics in the sort of like niche down, like I guess you call it like a specific way you view it. If you look at it in the generalized form, printing money to fund government deficits is nothing new, right? This happened in ancient Rome, um, under Tiberius and others who debased the currency. And it happened in Greece, and it happened in Mesopotamia, and it happened in Great Britain, and it happened in Portugal and Spain. Like this has happened time and time and time and time and time again. And it's just in the past it was much simpler. It was, oh, I'm the government agency, I'm the treasury, I'm going to call in a couple percent, whatever we get in tax receipts in the form of coins, I'm going to melt them down, add a bit of copper, and then send them back out, remint them, and call it money. And then I'll do that over and over and over again until the denarii loses 90% of its silver value in 300 years. And so that's what played out in ancient Rome, and that's essentially like a very simplified version of what's playing out today.
So is this what is um, drives a lot of the interest and investment into Bitcoin? Is those that are concerned about their money, whether it's in uh, yen or U.S. dollars, and not knowing what the government's going to do or how it's going to act and how it's going to affect your personal finances. Is that a protection against that?
Is Bitcoin a protection against the inflation? Absolutely. Bitcoin.
Inflation, deflation, whatever it ends up being.
Well, it's yes, it is, because again, the system as it exists cannot survive a real deflation, right? I mean, the system almost died in 2008 under just what I would call like a financial market
Did it?
deflation. It
I mean,
almost died.
that's
Well,
what we were scared into. That was, and I think, again, they, you're they bailed out banks that shouldn't be in business, that are doing poor things and put us in the situation that we were in. Is
well,
perverse.
yeah, true. It is perverse and it is wrong, right? But this is what I tell libertarians. Like, I'm mostly libertarian, right? I would agree with a lot
Oh,
of the
my
sentiments
friend
they
will
have.
love listening to this.
Oh, absolutely. I agree, but you have to see the world for how it is, not how you want it to be. And so, although these banks shouldn't have been able to do the things that they did, and although the Fed shouldn't have bailed them out and the Treasury shouldn't have started the TARP program, they did. Because again, to perpetuate the people in power and to perpetuate the system as it exists, you have to do those things to ensure it survives. And we were very close. We were at the red, at the red line of the system. The warning lights were blinking red, and a neutron bomb was going to hit the Death Star of our financial system. Timothy Geithner, the president of the New York Fed, reported that on September 15th, right after Lehman failed, that several large ACH companies and banks started telling him that if they wouldn't allow a some form of bailout in the financial system within a week, that the ATMs would stop working because the banks were seeing such high withdrawals of cash that they were running out of liquidity, of cash liquidity, physical cash. And so you could see this domino, right, of AIG failing, Lehman failing, banks failing, and again under this fractional reserve system where the banks only hold 10% of the actual deposit liabilities in actual assets that are cash or cash like, then that means that overnight 90% of people who think they have money in the bank find out they actually don't have any money. And what happens when 90% of people basically lose everything is you see massive deflation. All the demand collapses, the
You see
entire system goes
suicide.
down. Yeah. Yeah, it's
You see
systemic.
people
That's what I'm
jumping out
saying.
the
It's
window.
it's it's
So that
systemic
that's a great
suicide.
argument
So
for Bitcoin. Then, if you put your money in Bitcoin, then that helps prevent the government from not having to call a bank holiday. Uh,
well, the
That's
way the way the genius of Bitcoin is that you're opting out completely, right? I'm taking my monetary energy, my dollars, and I'm putting them into a system that is not tied to the current fiat system, not controlled by the current fiat system. And so that means that if there is a deflation, if there is a economic collapse, I could go out and pay somebody with Bitcoin for my coffee. I could go out and pay somebody with Bitcoin for my car, for a new car, and I wouldn't even have to use the traditional financial rails to borrow, to worry about it. The problem with the Bitcoiners is that they all think that this is going to happen overnight, and I say no. The current system has a lot of things going for it. It has a network effect. It has debt, which you need, like we said earlier, when you have a debt in dollars, you need a dollar income stream to pay off that liability. And so that means that there's dollar demand. And so in order for us to move from a fiat system to, let's say, a Bitcoin system or even a Bitcoin backed system, you would need to have not only the carrot of Bitcoin price go up, it's better money, it's less inflation, there's not as much bailouts, and they can't print the money, so they can't infinite bail out their friends and their cronies. Um, you also have to have the stick of the current system is failing. Holy crap, inflation's at 50%. What do I do? How do I pay for my groceries this week? Well, I
Well, it
should try
sounds like, I
something
mean,
else.
that almost feels like that is the solution, or we have to wait until another 2008 to appear, or another high inflationary situation, which maybe would happen if they started dropping the interest rates again.
Well, there's never been a change in reserve currencies, right, without a major crisis. And for the British pound, it was World War II and them essentially losing all of their colonies, and whatever it was, a quarter of their military age males. Um, for the U.S., it's going to be something different. And you're right; it probably would be like an echo of 2008. But the end game, like I've always told everybody, is more inflation and more liquidity. They're not going to allow the system to deflate because who owns the most assets in the system? Who has the most to lose? It's the people who are the wealthiest, the people who control the system as it stands today. And so, why would they allow deflation and allow them to? My portfolio of 10 grand goes down by 9 grand. Oh, that sucks. Their
So,
portfolio of
so
100 million goes down
we
by
need a
90 million.
we need Mandami to be president.
I'm not saying this is just.
That was
I
that
don't
was
want
that
to
was
make any
that was a joke.
prognosis.
That was a joke. I'm
Yeah.
not serious.
Yeah. But no, but unfortunately, that's where the system is going to trend. Like that's just the reality of it, right? It's towards the Mondamis of the world, towards the, Pelosi's, towards the Bernie Sanders, towards even the Trumpian, right? Like you want to spend and more money, create more liquidity in whatever way you can. And so whether you brand it as a conservative pro-military stance or as a liberal pro-healthcare stance, it's going to be spent either way. It's going to be printed either way.
I think, man. Well, we covered a lot. Um, there are a lot of other areas still to go to, but I think this is good area to end on. I really appreciate your time and help explaining, and it's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's again, these are the economic realities that I've come to discover over the last, I guess it's been 8 years now that I've been studying macro intensively, actually more like 9 years. And so it's not the world that I would like to see or not the world I want to see, but it is the world that exists. And my view is I just have to accept whatever reality that is put in front of me. And this is what it, this is
Well, it's
what
also
is
about
existing right now.
educating as well. I mean, educating yourself, educating me on how do we prepare ourselves, for a another 2008 or something else unforeseen, or do we just assume and trust that they'll do whatever is necessary to continue growing the debt and keeping things running. But again, it's just you can't in a good natural working economy, you have to have booms and busts. There's no such thing as continuous unlimited growth.
Exactly. And even under hard money, or you could call it like a sound money system, right? Those had booms and busts. Go back and look at, the Panic of 1873 or the Panic of 1837. Like there were times when they under a sound money system where just people's behavior still enabled excessive exuberance, excessive lending, excessive borrowing, and then that excessiveness has to be repriced some way, and that comes in the form of a recession or a monetary contraction or asset prices falling.
I don't know why people can't understand. I mean, look, I understand that we want to limit the pain, and but again, now we've created such a bad situation, though, is that now it'll be pain that'll be so bad. I mean, it's hard, honestly. When I think about the Great Depression, in compared to what other countries have gone through over the last few decades, I think there was a 10% unemployment, or was it more closer to 25% during the Great Depression. Um, but you know, I think other countries have gone through much worse. I think Greece has probably gone through much worse. Argentina, uh, you know, and we went through it, and then the U.S. economy was all the stronger, moving forward after that. I mean, World War II helped, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's one of those things where, people think that an economic downturn or something would be the end of the world, but in reality humans are very resilient, and humans adapt, and humans survive. And even if your asset prices fall and your stocks fall and your income goes down in real terms or nominal terms, where there's a will, there's a way. And as a species, we've gotten through harder times than this. And so the real solution here is to take the pain, take the medicine, bitter medicine now, because the longer you rate and the lower you bring rates, the more debt's created and the more pain that you're going to inflict. And so it's just best to get it over with now.
Well, that's what I'd like to try to help educate people on, and think more about. Roberto, sorry. Um,
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Wonderful talking. Have a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to chatting again.
Thank you. I appreciate this. And yeah, I'm always happy to do these kinds of conversations. It's great to talk with people who are similarly informed. And, if people want to find my work, I have Twitter. It's at Peruvian underscore bull. I have a YouTube channel. Like I said, look up Peruvian bull, and I have a Substack, which is Dollar Endgame. So if you just look up Dollar Endgame Substack, you'll find me.